Brandon Torres shuffled through the main entrance of Galactic Security Station Omega-7, yawning and checking his wrist chronometer for the third time in 2 minutes. The coffee hadn't kicked in yet, and honestly, Mondays were bad enough without having to deal with the usual alien bureaucracy that came with working on an intergalactic space station. "Morning," he mumbled to nobody in particular, approaching the security checkpoint like he had every workday for the past 8 months. Same routine, same bored expression, same wrinkled uniform that probably needed washing, but tomorrow was laundry day. The gate scanner hummed to life as Brandon extended his arm toward the sensor pad, already mentally rehearsing his apology to Amy Kowalski for being late again. She was going to dock his pay, no question about it, and he still owed rent on his tiny quarters in Section C. Then it froze. The holographic display flickered once, twice, and then blazed to life with text so bright it practically burned retinas across 3 species. Admiral Vashi, a 7-foot-tall Zephyrian with skin like polished obsidian, dropped his steaming cup of whatever that purple liquid was supposed to be. It splattered across the security booth floor with a hiss that suggested it was either highly acidic or possibly sentient. "By the 13 moons of Korthak," Vashi whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager asking someone to prom. His 4 eyes were locked on the display, pupils dilated to pinpoints of sheer terror. Commander Tom Marley, significantly shorter but compensating with enough military decorations to fund a small planet, stumbled backward into the emergency alarm button. Red lights immediately began strobing throughout the checkpoint, accompanied by a klaxon that sounded like a dying whale having an argument with a freight train. "This cannot be happening," Marley muttered, frantically tapping his communication device. "This absolutely positively cannot be happening on my shift. I have 2 rotations left before retirement." Brandon blinked at the chaos erupting around him, then glanced at his chronometer again. Guys. I really need to get through. Amy's going to murder me if I'm late again, and she already threatened to reassign me to waste disposal duty. Do you know what Gorth waste smells like? Because I do, and it's not something you forget." Both alien officers stared at him like he had just announced his intention to juggle live grenades while tap dancing on their graves. "You," Admiral Vashi's voice came out as barely more than a squeak. "You are aware that the scanner has detected divine energy signatures consistent with direct physical contact with an apex god, correct?" Brandon shrugged. "Look, I don't know what that means, but if it helps, I showered this morning. Well, mostly. Okay, I used some of that dry cleaning spray stuff, but it smells like flowers, so same thing, right?" Commander Marley's left eye began twitching. It was a small twitch, barely noticeable, but in the grand scheme of things happening at Security Station Omega-7 that morning, it might as well have been a supernova. "Containment Team Alpha to Checkpoint 7, Marley spoke into his comm device, his voice remarkably steady, considering his worldview was currently being fed through a wood chipper. "We have a Code Omega situation. Repeat, Code Omega. And someone called Judge Quintara. She's going to want to see this." Brandon checked his chronometer one more time and sighed. This is going to be one of those days, isn't it? The station's intercom crackled to life with the kind of static that suggested either poor maintenance or impending doom. Given recent events, both seemed equally likely. "Attention all personnel," came the crisp, bureaucratic voice of Judge Quintara, a Valdorian whose species had evolved the ability to make even casual conversation sound like a legal proceeding. "This station is now under Code Omega lockdown. Repeat, Code Omega lockdown is in effect immediately. All non-essential personnel report to designated safe zones. All essential personnel report to battle stations. Someone bring me Form 47B for apocalyptic event documentation, and make sure it's the revised version with the extra carbon copies." Throughout the station, blast doors began slamming shut with the subtle delicacy of a meteor impact. Emergency lighting bathed everything in an ominous red glow that made even the friendliest alien species look like they were auditioning for a horror movie. In the cafeteria wing, a Glorbish chef named Zort dropped an entire tray of what humans generously called space nachos, sending luminescent cheese substitute flying across 3 tables. "Apex God protocols," he whispered to his sous chef, a nervous Plixian with too many tentacles and not enough confidence. I haven't seen those activated since the great tentacle uprising of The sous chef's tentacles immediately tied themselves into what could only be described as a panic pretzel. But that was just a drill, right? Right, Chef Zort. Please tell me that was just a drill. That, Zort replied grimly, scraping fluorescent cheese off his apron, was not a drill. Back at the security checkpoint, Brandon was beginning to suspect that his day had taken a turn for the decidedly weird. The red lighting made everything look like the inside of a lava lamp, and the klaxons were giving him a headache that felt suspiciously like the time he'd tried Regillian whiskey on a dare. Okay, seriously, Brandon said, raising his voice over the cacophony. Can someone please call Amy Kowalski and tell her I'm going to be late? Her number's in the employee directory under Kowalski Amy, cafeteria supervisor. Do not cross. She's probably already planning my funeral, and I really need this job. Admiral Vashi stared at him with the kind of expression typically reserved for watching someone juggle live explosives while blindfolded. You are concerned about employment punctuality? At a time like this? Well, yeah, Brandon replied, as if this were the most obvious thing in the universe. I mean, I get that there's some kind of emergency going on, but emergencies happen all the time around here. Last week it was the quantum coffee machine gaining sentience, and the week before that, someone accidentally opened a portal to what turned out to be a dimension made entirely of angry bees. But Amy doesn't care about interdimensional bee invasions when the breakfast rush starts at 0600. Commander Marley made a sound that might have been a whimper if military personnel were allowed to whimper, which they weren't. So it was definitely a tactical vocalization of concern. The human thinks this is routine, Marley muttered into his communicator. Repeat. The human believes this is routine station maintenance. How is that possible? How is that even remotely possible? The response came back through static and what sounded like someone hyperventilating. Unknown, Commander. Judge Quintara wants the subject moved to Interrogation Chamber Alpha immediately. And Commander? She also wants you to stop calling it routine station maintenance. Apparently it's giving her stress-induced molting. Brandon perked up at the word interrogation. Oh, are you guys conducting some kind of survey? Because I filled out the employee satisfaction form last month, and I was pretty honest about the bathroom situation in sections. Those sonic showers are way too loud, and don't get me started on the toilet paper that's apparently made from recycled meteor fragments. Admiral Vashi's 4 eyes began blinking in sequence, which in Zephyrian body language either meant deep contemplation or complete neural shutdown. Based on current circumstances, both seemed equally likely. Move him to the chamber, Vashi whispered, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just realized that the universe had a sense of humor, and it wasn't particularly kind. Interrogation Chamber Alpha had been designed by committee, which explained why it managed to be both intimidatingly sterile and uncomfortably beige at the same time. General Krafnog stood behind a one-way mirror, adjusting his 17 military medals for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. As the station's chief interrogator, he had broken hardened space pirates, interdimensional smugglers, and once, memorably, a sentient computer virus that had developed trust issues. But none of that had prepared him for whatever was sitting in his interrogation chair, humming what sounded like an ancient Terran folk song about someone named Old MacDonald. Begin recording, Krafnog commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had stared into the abyss and convinced it to confess to tax evasion. Interrogation log 4472 subject, human designation, Brandon Torres, suspected of. He paused, still not quite believing the words. Suspected of surviving direct divine contact with an Apex-class entity. Brandon looked up from examining his fingernails and waved cheerfully at the mirror. Hi there! Is this about that customer service survey? Because I really think the vending machines in Section D need better selection. I mean, who stocks a snack machine with nothing but pickled gorblat tentacles? That's just asking for trouble. In the observation booth, Moran, the station's head translator and communication specialist, was already reaching for his emergency stress inhaler. His pale blue skin had taken on a distinctly greenish tinge that suggested either nausea or the onset of molting season. General, perhaps we should start with basic identification protocols. Excellent point, Krafnog replied, settling into his intimidation stance. He had practiced this pose in front of a mirror for 3 years until he could make hardened criminals weep just by adjusting his posture. State your name and describe your weekend activities. Oh, easy one, Brandon replied with the enthusiasm of someone answering a trivia question about their favorite pizza topping. Brandon Torres, Human Resources, generously describes me as a food service technician level 2, though Amy says I'm more like a level 1.5 on good days. As for the weekend, I went camping. First time in months I actually got off this tin can and found some real dirt to sleep on. Krafnog's left antenna twitched. This was either a very good sign or a very bad sign, depending on your perspective and species of origin. Camping. Define this activity. You know, standard human stuff, Brandon shrugged, apparently oblivious to the fact that several species in the galaxy considered standard human stuff to be roughly equivalent to recreational insanity. Packed my sleeping bag, grabbed some trail mix and energy drinks, found a nice spot in the mountains on Kepler 440b. Great hiking trails, beautiful views, minimal risk of being eaten by anything larger than a house. Morin made a strangled sound and clutched his translator device like it was a lifeline. General, he whispered. Kepler 4042b is a restricted zone. The entire planet is considered a Class 9 hazard due to what? Krafnog demanded. Due to it being the known location of the eternal prison of Zyx'quin the Destroyer, Moran replied just before his eyes rolled back and he collapsed onto the observation deck with a thud that echoed through the chamber. Brandon perked up at the sound. Oh, is someone okay? Because I know basic first aid. Well, human first aid. I'm not sure how it works with all the extra limbs and tentacles, but the principles are probably similar, right? Krafnog stared at the unconscious translator, then back at Brandon, who was now helpfully suggesting that someone should probably check if Moran needed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, though he wasn't sure which mouth they should use since some species had multiples. Continue your account, Krafnog said, his voice notably higher than it had been 30 seconds ago. You went to Kepler 4042b for recreational purposes. Right, so I'm hiking around, taking pictures of those weird purple rock formations, Brandon continued, apparently warming to his topic. And I found this really cool boulder that was making these interesting humming sounds. Kind of musical, actually. Reminded me of my grandmother's old radio, the way it would pick up those late-night talk shows from 3 systems over. In the medical bay, where Moran had been quickly transported, the station's chief medical officer was administering what appeared to be either a sedative or possibly last rites. It was difficult to tell with Plixian medical procedures. The boulder, Krafnog said carefully, was humming. Oh yeah, definitely humming. Really catchy tune too. So naturally, I sat down and had lunch with it. General Krafnog's right eye began twitching in what medical professionals would later classify as aggressive neural rebellion. He pressed a button on his communicator with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested he was either maintaining professional composure or having a complete mental breakdown in slow motion. Quartermaster, A to Interrogation Chamber, Alpha. Immediately. Bring the Prophecy archives. All of them. His voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had just realized that their weekend plans now included filing paperwork for the potential end of civilization. Brandon, meanwhile, was digging around in his jacket pocket and producing what appeared to be a crumpled energy bar wrapper and a small, smooth stone that seemed to emit a faint, pulsing glow. Oh, and I brought back a souvenir. The boulder gave it to me, said it was some kind of friendship token, which was really sweet. You don't usually meet such polite rocks. The observation deck, which had been hastily restaffed after Moran's medical evacuation, fell into the kind of silence typically reserved for funeral homes and tax audits. 3 technicians stood frozen at their monitoring stations, staring at the glowing stone like it was a live grenade with trust issues. The boulder, Krafnog repeated slowly, gave you a gift. Well, technically, it kind of just appeared next to my backpack after we finished talking, Brandon clarified. examining the stone with the casual interest of someone discussing the weather. But yeah, nice gesture. We had a really good conversation about hiking trails, and the best way to avoid getting lost in interdimensional forest preserves. Apparently most people don't bother to actually ask for directions when they're out there, which explains why the missing hiker statistics are so terrible. The chamber door burst open with enough force to suggest that either someone was very excited or the hinges needed serious maintenance. Quartermaster A stumbled in, dragging a hover cart loaded with ancient texts, digital archives, and what appeared to be a crystal ball that was definitely not regulation equipment, but nobody wanted to ask about it. Quartermaster A was a Thraxian, which meant he had roughly the same build as a very nervous scarecrow, and the organizational skills of someone who had spent their entire career preparing for paperwork emergencies. His 3 arms were already rifling through files with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew that the next few minutes would determine whether he spent his retirement in a nice beach house or a smoking crater. "General," he gasped, producing a leather-bound tome that looked old enough to predate the invention of common sense. "I need to verify something. Human, describe this boulder in more detail. Specifically, did it mention its name?" Brandon scratched his head thoughtfully. "Oh, sure. Really unusual name, actually. Started with a Z, Zack something. Zyx'quin. Yeah, that was it. Zyx'quin," said most people just screamed when they heard it, which seemed kind of rude. I mean, it's not his fault his parents gave him a difficult name to pronounce. The ancient tome slipped from Quartermaster A's primary grip and hit the floor with a thud that somehow managed to sound ominous. The crystal ball, apparently sensing the dramatic tension, began glowing with an eerie purple light that matched absolutely nothing in the station's color scheme. "Zyx'quin the Destroyer," Quartermaster A whispered, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for discussing natural disasters or tax penalties. "The render of realities. The cosmic devourer. The entity so terrifying that entire civilizations developed religions specifically dedicated to never mentioning his name." Brandon nodded agreeably. "Yeah, he mentioned the name thing. Said it was causing him some real social problems. Poor guy's been stuck on that planet for, what did he say, 12,000 years. Just sitting there humming to himself, no one to talk to. He was really excited to have some company." "Company," General Krafnog repeated, his voice reaching octaves that his species wasn't technically supposed to be capable of producing.
"Well, absolutely."
"We talked for hours. He's got some really interesting stories about the old days. Did you know that the Great War of Dimensional Collapse was actually started by a clerical error? Someone filed Form 23C instead of Form 23B, and before you know it, 3 galaxies were at each other's throats. Bureaucracy, am I right?" Quartermaster A was now frantically flipping through pages with all 3 hands, muttering ancient prophecies under his breath like the world's most stressed-out fortune-teller. Here it is. "And lo, the destroyer shall speak unto the innocent of heart, and in that speaking shall find release from his eternal bonds." He looked up at Brandon with the expression of someone who had just realized that the universe's biggest practical joke was being played on him personally. "Release," he continued reading, "shall come through acts of simple kindness and the sharing of sustenance, for even the mightiest of cosmic horrors craves nothing more than genuine conversation and trail mix." Brandon brightened considerably. "Oh, that's us. He really liked my trail mix," said the little yogurt raisins, were a nice touch. "I gave him the rest of the bag actually. He seemed pretty lonely, and I had extra supplies." The crystal ball's purple glow was now pulsing in rhythm with what sounded suspiciously like cosmic laughter. "Gentlemen," he announced, wheeling in a cart loaded with scanning equipment that looked like it had been designed by someone with a serious grudge against the laws of physics. "I understand we have a human who claims to have survived direct contact with a Class Omega divine entity. Fascinating stuff. Absolutely fascinating. Dr. Mortin was a Corellian, which meant he had the general appearance of a praying mantis that had been to college and developed strong opinions about proper laboratory procedure. His compound eyes gleamed with the kind of scientific enthusiasm that had historically led to either breakthrough discoveries or smoking craters where laboratories used to be. "Now then," he continued, adjusting what appeared to be a helmet covered in blinking sensors. I'll need to conduct a full energy residue scan to determine the extent of divine contamination. This equipment is calibrated to detect even the faintest traces of godly influence. State-of-the-art technology, imported directly from the Temporal Research Institute on Vega Prime. Brandon looked at the helmet with polite interest. That's really cool looking. Is it safe? 'Cause I've got kind of a weird reaction to some scanning equipment. Last time I had a medical scan, the machine started playing what sounded like elevator music but in languages that don't technically exist yet. Dr. Morton's mandibles clicked together in what passed for scientific amusement among his species. My dear human, this equipment has been tested on subjects who have survived encounters with minor deities, cosmic anomalies, and once, memorably, a sentient nebula with delusions of grandeur. Your case may be unprecedented, but I assure you the technology is completely safe. He placed the sensor helmet on Brandon's head and immediately began adjusting dials on a control panel that had more buttons than seemed strictly necessary for any reasonable scientific purpose. Now if you'll just sit still while I calibrate the divine energy receptors, Dr. Morton muttered, his 6 hands dancing across various controls with practiced efficiency. We should be able to get a clear reading of exactly what kind of cosmic forces you've been exposed to. It wasn't a small explosion. It wasn't even a medium-sized explosion. It was the kind of explosion that suggested the universe had just received some very surprising news and decided to express its feelings through aggressive thermodynamics. Dr. Morton found himself sitting on the floor, covered in what had recently been several million credits worth of precision scientific equipment, his lab coat smoking and his compound eyes displaying the glazed expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been fed through a particle accelerator. Oops, Brandon said mildly, pulling off the remains of the sensor helmet, which was now more of a sensor suggestion than actual functional equipment. Sorry about that. This kind of thing happens to me a lot. I probably should have mentioned the elevator music thing earlier. The sprinkler system chose that moment to activate, dousing everyone in the chamber with water that smelled faintly of recycled air and bureaucratic disappointment. Brandon immediately began patting his pockets and produced a small plastic card. Hey, look, I've got insurance. Well, it's a human credit card, but it should cover equipment damages. Right? I mean, how expensive could this stuff be? General Krafnog, who was still trying to process the fact that his interrogation chamber now looked like the aftermath of a very small war, stared at the credit card like it was an artifact from a lost civilization. You want to pay for the destruction of our most advanced scanning equipment with a consumer financial instrument? It's got a really good damage protection plan, Brandon offered helpfully. Plus, I get rewards points for unusual purchases. This would definitely qualify as unusual. Quartermaster A, who had been frantically documenting everything for what was undoubtedly going to be the most complicated insurance claim in galactic history, looked up from his clipboard with the expression of someone who had just realized that his job description didn't cover acts of God for very good reasons. How, he asked in a voice that suggested his sanity was hanging by a thread, exactly does one file a requisition for equipment destroyed by residual divine energy? What's the proper form classification for that? Judge Quintara arrived at the interrogation chamber trailing a small army of legal clerks, insurance assessors and what appeared to be a professional crisis management consultant, whose business card probably read, specializing in apocalyptic events and liability issues. Her Valdorian features were set in the expression of someone who had spent the last hour trying to figure out how to legally classify a human who had apparently befriended the universe's most feared cosmic entity. All right, she announced, settling into a chair that had been hastily brought in for what was clearly going to be a very long afternoon. I need to understand exactly what happened on Kepler 442, and I mean exactly. Because according to our preliminary reports, either we're dealing with the most significant theological event in galactic history, or our scanning equipment needs a serious recalibration. Brandon looked up from examining the smoking remains of Dr. Morton's scanner, which he had been poking with the scientific curiosity of someone who wasn't entirely sure why machines kept exploding around him. Oh, that's easy. I got lost. The assembled aliens exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey both relief and deep existential concern. Lost, Judge Quintara repeated, making notes on a legal pad that appeared to be designed specifically for recording impossible events. Elaborate. Well, I was hiking the Celestial Ridge Trail, which is supposed to be a nice easy 6-hour loop, Brandon explained, settling back in his chair like someone about to recount a mildly interesting fishing story. But I took a wrong turn at what I thought was the scenic overlook marker and ended up in this really remote valley. Beautiful place actually. Very quiet. Lots of interesting rock formations. Brandon shrugged. Didn't really notice any reality distortion. I mean, my GPS got a little wonky, and my compass started pointing in directions that don't technically exist, but I figured that was just normal mountain stuff. So I kept hiking until I found this clearing with the humming boulder. And you approached it, General Krafnog said, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to understand why anyone would voluntarily walk toward obvious mortal danger. Well, yeah, it was humming Danny Boy, which is one of my grandmother's favorite songs. Seemed friendly enough, plus I was kind of hungry, and it looked like a nice spot for lunch. Judge Quintara made several more notes, then paused and stared at her legal pad like it had personally insulted her mother. You sat down next to Zyx'quin, the destroyer, because he was humming a song that reminded you of your grandmother. That's right, and he turned out to be a really good listener. I told him about my job, my apartment, the weird smell in Section C that nobody can figure out. He told me stories about the old days before he got stuck on that planet. Turns out he wasn't always a cosmic horror. Originally, he was more of a cosmic landscaper. The crystal ball, which had been providing ominous background lighting for the entire interrogation, suddenly dimmed and began displaying what looked suspiciously like vacation photos of scenic mountain ranges. A landscaper, Dr. Morting croaked from his position on the floor, where he was still trying to reassemble his scientific dignity along with his exploded equipment. Yeah, he specialized in planetary beautification projects. You know, arranging mountain ranges, designing ocean coastlines, that sort of thing. But then there was this big bureaucratic mix-up in the cosmic planning department, and he got reclassified as a universal threat instead of freelance geological consultant. He's been trying to get his paperwork sorted out for 12,000 years. Judge Quintara's pen snapped, not bent, snapped, clean in half. Pretty much. Really frustrating situation. He showed me some of his portfolio work actually. The Grand Canyon was one of his beautiful craftsmanship. He was really proud of the layered rock formations. Brandon reached into his backpack and produced a small device that looked like a standard hiking GPS, except for the fact that it was now displaying coordinates in dimensions that mathematically shouldn't exist. Anyway, after we finished lunch and he told me about his landscaping career, I asked him for directions back to the parking lot. That's when he gave me this updated GPS unit. Said it would help me navigate interdimensional hiking trails more safely in the future. Really considerate, actually. The assembled aliens stared at the device like it was a ticking bomb, with a personality disorder. The most feared entity in known space, General Krafnog said faintly, gave you navigational assistance to help you find your car. Well, it was getting late, and I had to return the rental shuttle by 1800 hours or they'd charge extra fees. Zyx'quin totally understood. He said customer service has really gone downhill since the old days, and late fees are just adding insult to injury. The crystal ball began displaying what appeared to be a customer satisfaction survey with surprisingly positive ratings. 3 hours, 47 minutes, and one unprecedented bureaucratic nightmare later, Brandon Torres finally stood outside the cafeteria wing of Galactic Security Station Omega-7, holding a freshly laminated ID badge that read Brandon Torres, Class X Anomaly. Authorized for limited food service activities, handle with caution. Judge Quintara had spent the better part of an hour trying to figure out the proper legal classification for someone who had accidentally resolved a 12,000-year-old cosmic imprisonment through what she could only describe in official documents as aggressive friendliness and snack-based diplomacy. "We're releasing you to continue your normal duties," she had announced. her voice carrying the weary tone of someone who had just spent 47 minutes on hold with the Galactic Insurance Bureau's Acts of God department. However, you are now classified as a Class X anomaly, which means you're required to file a report anytime you encounter talking geological formations, interdimensional wildlife, or customer service representatives from extinct civilizations. Brandon had nodded agreeably and asked if this came with a pay raise, which had caused Judge Quintara to develop a stress-related eye twitch that her medical officer would later classify as bureaucratic trauma syndrome. Now standing outside the cafeteria doors, Brandon checked his chronometer one final time, took a deep breath, and prepared to face the wrath of Amy Kowalski, who was probably already composing his termination letter in 17 different languages, including 2 that weren't technically speakable by beings with fewer than 4 vocal cords. The cafeteria was in full lunch rush mode, which meant controlled chaos with a side order of barely contained panic. Steam rose from various cooking surfaces. Alien customers formed orderly lines that somehow managed to look disorderly, and the familiar sounds of intergalactic food service filled the air with a symphony of sizzling, chopping, and what sounded like someone arguing with a sentient salad dispenser. Amy Kowalski stood behind the main service counter like a general surveying a battlefield, her graying hair pulled back in a bun that could probably deflect small meteors, and her expression suggesting she had been waiting for this moment with the patience of a cosmic predator. "Torres," she called out, her voice cutting through the cafeteria noise with surgical precision. "You're 3 hours and 47 minutes late. I've already docked your pay, reassigned your prep duties to the new Glorbish kid, and filled out Form 23A for excessive tardiness with suspicious circumstances." Brandon hurried over to the service line, tying his apron and trying to project a kind of professional competence that suggested he hadn't recently been classified as a potential threat to galactic stability. "Sorry, Amy, there was this whole thing with security and some kind of scanning equipment malfunction, and honestly it got really weird really fast." Amy's expression suggested she had heard every excuse in the known universe, and several from dimensions that didn't technically exist yet. "I don't want to hear it, Torres. Just get on the soup station and try not to cause any more interdimensional incidents before your shift ends." Brandon nodded and moved to the soup station, where a large pot of what the menu generously described as daily special surprise was simmering with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested it was either very good soup or possibly achieving sentience. As he began ladling the soup into bowls for the lunch line, Brandon couldn't help but notice that customers were staring at him more than usual. Not just casual glances, but the kind of intense observation typically reserved for watching dangerous wildlife or experimental scientific procedures. A Regillian diplomat in line for soup suddenly straightened up, his respiratory system making sounds that suggested either extreme surprise or the onset of a medical emergency. "By the rings of Saturn," he gasped. "My chronic flux syndrome. It's completely gone." Behind him, a Centaurian engineer who had been complaining about recurring scales rot, looked down at her arms in amazement as her condition visibly cleared up. "The scaling, it's healing." Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around the soup station, with aliens from 17 different species discovering that various chronic conditions, lingering ailments, and what one customer described as existential digestive issues, were suddenly and mysteriously cured after consuming Brandon's soup. Amy Kowalski looked at the growing crowd of miraculously healed aliens, then at Brandon, then back at the soup, and made a mental note to request hazard pay.